Crimson Portals, by Stephen Lake. The Guardian Series Part 6. Paul scanned the area ahead of them as he, and a group of over 200 other Guardians, flew at supersonic speed over the Amazon jungle. Normally he didn't lead a large group of fellow Guardians like this. But this special assignment was given to him due to his recent encounter with a pair of Rexes that had flipped sides and gone against their master, the still mysterious monster known by most as the Emperor of Ashes. He was also put in this position because he was one of the oldest and most senior Guardians of them all. Not far away, to his right, flew Destin, his apprentice, who was leading one half of his team, with Jack, a former office co-worker of his, leading the other, as he'd split the force between them for both logistical and leadership reasons. He also knew Destin and Jack, and trusted their instincts, as well as the depths of Destin's military intuition. For being a simple Marine corporal, albeit now a former one, having only recently joined the Guardian Corps full-time, his understanding of combat and the overall battlefield was second to none among his team. This would prove advantageous to Paul and all those under him, as most of the fighters that had been assigned to him for this mission had come from white-collar office jobs, and were still somewhat green in the fighting department. However, for a simple investigatory team, they would more than suffice. Well, at least until things got crazy, which he hoped they wouldn't. As Paul's team continued onward, he looked back at another man just to his right, and waved to get his attention. "How much further?" he asked over the roar of the wind. A man named James, a former airline pilot, looked down at the GPS device on his arm, and then motioned with his head to a location not far away. "If what the Rexes gave us is correct, it should be just over that hill ahead of us," he replied. Realizing they were getting extremely close to their target, one that they knew very little about, Paul called a halt to their flight. As soon as he did, Destin and Jack quickly ordered their men to spread out, a tactically cautionary maneuver that would make them less vulnerable in the event that they were ambushed. Once everyone was in place, both men floated over to Paul. "So what's our first move, sir?" asked Destin. However, Paul didn't answer him. Instead, he reached out with his hands, closed his eyes, and began to use his powers to sweep the area for clues. It wasn't long before he found what he was looking for. He soon lowered his hands and opened his eyes. Seeing this, Destin immediately knew what it meant. "There's a portal up ahead, isn't there?" he asked. Paul nodded. "Yeah, and not just one. I can sense at least a dozen of them," he replied. "Anything coming through?" asked James. "Not at the moment. It's just open portals," replied Paul. "Isn't that a little unusual?" Paul shook his head. "Not really. I've seen them pre-stage portals like this before in anticipation of unleashing a major invasion. As such, we should get down there and prepare ourselves for what's about to come through," he replied. He then turned to Destin and said, "Let's stage everyone we have in layers around those portals to act as a barrier should something come through them soon. There's no point in letting anything get through if we can help it." Destin nodded, and immediately set about carrying out his orders. As the young man did, James floated closer to Paul and studied the area apprehensively. "Shouldn't we just blow up those portals to stop them from coming through? I can't see why we'd want to allow any more of those monsters into our world," he said. But Paul shook his head. "Blowing up portals isn't going to help us. This war will only end when there's nobody left to attack us. So, the sooner we wipe out his forces, the sooner this will be over," he said. Jack looked off into the distance and thought about this briefly. "So this is going to be a battle of attrition then?" he asked. Paul nodded. "Unfortunately. That sounds like an awful big problem. Are you sure your plan is going to work?" Paul pursed his lips slightly. "That's just it. I'm not. But, right now, that's the only option we have. The good news is, if what the Rexes have told us is true, then this war may be over sooner than we think, as the Emperor is apparently running low on troops and energy. That means that, in order to win, he's got to establish a strong beachhead in this dimension where he can rebuild. So, if we can run him out of troops, it'll blunt his spear and save our world. And, if we're lucky, it might even stop him completely. At least, that's my hope, anyways. James looked off in the distance, and pondered this answer. That assumes that the Rexes aren't lying to us. After all, they did come from the enemy's army. So anything they say should be considered suspect, he replied. Paul's eyes narrowed. Yeah, I've already thought about that. So we'll want to be extra careful until we're certain that they aren't. He then waited for several minutes as Destin continued to deploy their forces as they readied themselves for what would almost certainly be a brutal and costly battle. Just then his communicator crackled to life. Sir, all troops are deployed. What should we do next? Came Destin's voice. Has anybody got eyes on the portals? Asked Paul in reply. Not yet. Do you want me to send someone in? Yes, please. Who do you have that you trust? Sachs and Tesla would be good choices, came the reply. Do it. Acknowledged. A few moments later a boom echoed from the distance as two of Destin's guardians leapt forward towards the location of the portals. It wasn't long before they were on location, and hiding not far away amidst the jungle foliage. About a minute later Paul felt something poke at his mind. It was a telepathic communication skill that had appeared around the same time as his other powers. It didn't allow for two-way communication, but it did permit one person to not only see through the eyes of another, but also hear, taste, and touch as well. It was still a very odd thing for him to experience this, even after all he'd been through the past few years. Even so he found it to be a very helpful skill. The best part of it was that you couldn't use it on someone unless they permitted you to. So there was no risk that someone could use it to spy on you without you either knowing or permitting it. To begin using the skill, he quietly closed his eyes, and then connected his mind to that of Sachs, who was one of the two scouts. It wasn't long before the physical experiences of Sachs began to flow into his mind. What he saw next, though, thoroughly baffled him. There, floating a few feet above a ravaged section of jungle foliage, was a group of 12 portals, just like he'd previously sensed. However, they were unlike any that he'd ever seen before. These glowed a fiery, crimson red, and seemed almost furry in appearance. Needing to report this to his superiors, he disconnected from Sachs, and then activated his communicator. Central, this is DB-05631. We've got eyes on the reported portals and have confirmed their existence, just as the Rexes told us. However, they don't appear like anything I've ever seen before. Please advise, he said. DB-05631, can you please describe what you're seeing? Came the reply. Paul then quickly explained what he'd seen to his superiors. DB-05631, please stand by as we consult with the Rexes, over. Roger, we'll be standing by, replied Paul. A few moments later Destin floated over to him and stared off in the direction of the portals with a look of great concern in his eyes. Jack soon did as well. I know you're the boss of this mission, but something doesn't feel right about this, he said. Paul pursed his lips warily. Yeah, same here. What's your take on this? He asked. Jack crossed his arms and glared off into the distance. We keep our distance until we're sure what those things are. The last thing we need right now is to get ourselves blown up, or killed, because we rushed in too quickly, he said. I second that, sir, replied Destin. Yeah, I'm in agreement with you as well, said Paul. He then activated his communicator, and said, Sachs, Tesla, stay frosty. This may be a trap. I don't know if it's a trap, or not, sir, but it's starting to do something, said Sachs in reply. Paul perked up at this. What do you mean? He asked. They're, well, spinning. Spinning, thought Paul in surprise. He then reconnected to Sachs, and began to see what he was seeing. However, as soon as he did, his blood immediately ran cold. Those weren't portals. They were a bomb. He immediately disconnected from Sachs, and then keyed his communicator. Everyone, pull back. Get out of the area. It's a trap. Those portals are about to blow, he shouted over the communicator. At first nobody moved, being far too surprised at what they'd just heard. Go, 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 "Now!" shouted Paul. This second frantically barked order soon snapped everyone out of their shocked detachment, and brought them back to the harsh reality of the moment. Immediately, and without further hesitation, every Guardian in the area turned and accelerated away at supersonic speed as they tried to put as much distance between themselves and the portals that were now rapidly building up energy. And, while Paul didn't know for certain what they were about to do, he had a really good idea from all of his prior experiences, and knew that it wouldn't end well for them if they didn't get out of range of them soon. Suddenly, an earth-shaking, fast-moving, and powerful burst of energy, in a great red dome of brilliant light, erupted out from where the portals were at in the jungle and quickly consumed everything in its path. A few moments later the brilliant sphere of red energy collapsed in on itself and then detonated in an explosion so powerful that it would have rivaled the infamous Tsar Bomba. The subsequent shockwave spread out at supersonic speed, flattening the jungle for miles in every direction before eventually petering out, leaving behind a massive, fiery circle of devastation and destruction in its wake. Deciding that they'd reached a safe distance from the blast, Paul called a halt to their retreat, and then regrouped his team. To his relief, everyone had survived unharmed. "Well, that was terrifying," said James, a hint of fear still ringing strongly in his voice. Jack studied the slowly rising mushroom cloud in the distance and frowned angrily. He was extremely grateful that they hadn't rushed in and possibly lost their lives as a result, as they likely wouldn't have survived that explosion had they not fled when they did. "I knew we shouldn't have trusted those Rexes," he growled. Paul narrowed his eyes slightly at this. "I don't think this was their doing," he replied. "What do you mean?" Paul shrugged slightly. "Why be guaranteed of dying just to kill a few of us? Wouldn't you send us on countless wild goose chases rather than this? So I think they're the ones who got betrayed, and not us." "Why would they get betrayed?" Paul scratched his chin as he thought about this. "Those Rexes are just low-level grunts. To the Emperor they're expendable assets who would only know what they were either told, or had learned on their own. Thus in betraying them would easily be something I can see the Emperor doing. Also, being who they are, he would have almost certainly kept them on a very short leash. So it's unlikely that they came here without him knowing. That's why I think they had no part in this little ambush we just escaped." Jack frowned at this. "Which means they're now worthless to us." "Actually, they may not be," replied Paul. Jack and Destin were intrigued by this. "What do you mean, sir?" asked Destin. Just then Paul's communicator crackled to life. "DB05631, we just detected a massive energy discharge in your general location. Please advise your current situation and operational status," came a voice. Paul quickly filled them in on all that had happened, and his theories about the Rexes. However, there was no further replies for several minutes. Eventually, though, they got another call. "DB05631, withdraw your forces and head back to Central. We'll debrief you there." "Roger that, Central." "Heading home now," said Paul. He then had Jack and Destin gather everyone up, after which they all headed back to Central headquarters. Upon arriving, most of his team stayed in the air above the base, and watched over it. Given recent events, this was a reasonable reaction. As soon as Paul, Destin and Jack walked into the Central Command building they were greeted by a general, and one of the Rexes, the latter of which surprised him the most. "What are you doing out here?" he asked the Rex. Tyrone, a name given to him by his captors, bowed apologetically to Paul. "Forgive me. I am a fool to think that our flight from our former dimension would go unnoticed. As such, I have brought great risk upon your life because of my foolishness," he said. But, to his surprise, Paul merely waved dismissively. "That's not a big deal. We kinda knew that was a possibility. Thankfully, though, we spotted the trap before anyone got hurt." The general, who was standing next to Tyrone, looked back and forth between Paul and the Rex, his eyes showing great concern as he did, as well as some degree of distrust. Paul quickly picked up on this even though no words had been spoken. "If you want my opinion, sir, I don't think they betrayed us," he said. Tyrone immediately perked up, and then glanced back and forth between the general and Paul. He soon realized what Paul was implying. "Have I lost your trust so easily?" he asked the general in surprise. The general glared at Tyrone. "Do you blame us after what just happened?" he asked. To his surprise, the Rex furrowed his brow and shook his head. "I do not. And, were I in your position, I would not find it even slightly unthinkable to have me executed on the charge of betraying you. However, I can assure you, General, that neither I, nor my companion, have done such a thing. We have only dealt with you in both yours, and our own best interests." Jack studied Tyrone deeply for several moments, and then looked at the general as he nodded in agreement. "I believe what he says, sir. I also believe that what Paul suggested to us earlier, that they were seen leaving, and thus used as pawns by the Emperor, is also true," he said. The general frowned. "Then they are worthless to us now," he muttered. However, Destin raised a finger and shook his head. "Not necessarily, sir. While the enemy almost certainly thinks that we've fallen for his trap, he also likely believes that we already have, or soon will, execute the Rexes for betraying us. As such, I don't believe that he will further act in opposition to what they have already told us about him," he said. Paul nodded at this. "Destin's right. Short of him seeing that we're still trusting these two Rexes, I think it's safe to believe that he'll continue on as before. So we should use that to our advantage." The general scowled at Paul because of this, and opened his mouth to speak, but then paused as alarms began to sound all across the building. Everyone looked around in surprise at this. "What in the devil is going on?" asked the general. A moment later, one of the command center staffers came running towards the men gathered there with a look of fear on his face. "Sir, we're receiving reports of large numbers of Rexes, bulls, and other monsters appearing all over the African nation of Chad," he shouted. The general looked at the man in surprise, and then over at Tyrone. "What is the meaning of this?" he shouted. However, Tyrone was not fazed by this. "It would seem that his plans, for the invasion of your world, have changed. The last thing he told us was that he intended to invade your South America, in the exact same place that he sprung his trap on you. I was not made aware of any other location. However, were I to make an educated guess, I believe this may be one of several other locations that he planned to use if the first one failed him." Paul pondered this briefly. That actually makes sense. If Tyrone only knew about the one location, then it's reasonable to believe that the Emperor would use that as a trap to destroy us, and any other forces that we would have deployed to that area. Therefore this attack in Central Africa may indeed be one of the alternate beachheads that the Emperor had already planned to use, just as Tyrone suggested. So we need to get our forces over there as quickly as possible to stop him. However, Tyrone raised his hand in a gesture to stop. This brought everyone's attention to him. "I would not abandon your South America just yet. He has already tricked us once. Thus, it would not be hard for him to do it again. Therefore, caution is advised in your actions," he said. Paul thought about this briefly, and then looked at the general. "Sir, my advice would be to send a small, rapid reaction force to the new area of activity to investigate it. We can safely ignore South America for now as we've still got enough bodies down there to cover that area in case this new attack in Africa is just a feint, and he still intends to invade us there just like before. Thus, until we hear differently, allow myself, and my men, to go to Africa and investigate this new breakout and be certain of that. If it's just another diversion, we'll move quickly to change location and reinforce whoever is fielding the main assault. But, if it's not, and this is his true intended target, then you'll need us boots on the ground over there as soon as possible," he said. The general thought about this for several moments, and then looked at everyone else around him. To his surprise, they all seemed to agree. Clearly they felt that Paul's idea was the best. "All right, you can go. But the moment you realize that this isn't the main invasion, I want you to contact us so we can determine what to do next," he said. "That's already the plan," grinned Paul. He then turned to the others, and said, "Saddle up and get ready. We may be walking into the biggest fight of our lives. So stay frosty." The others of Paul's team all shouted with excitement before turning and heading out the door. As they left, the general and Tyrone anxiously watched them go. Eventually the general turned and looked at the Rex. "I hope they're not walking into yet another trap," he said. Tyrone growled slightly as he frowned, and narrowed his eyes coldly. "So do I, General. So do I."